Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling the history of economic thought and how economic systems evolved in the 20th century. We've got some selections from J. Bradford DeLong's Slouching Towards Utopia and a few other historical pieces you gave us. And I think we're in for some surprises about how we got to where we are.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating stuff. DeLong doesn't just, write a dry textbook. He brings in the human element. Like Henry Ford, Nikola Tesla, John Maynard Keynes, he tells their stories too.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, let's lay out what we're seeing in these sources. One big theme is this tension between market forces, the invisible hand and all that, and the desire for social justice.
Right, and DeLong really highlights this idea that for a lot of people, rights go beyond just owning property. They want a community, a fair income, and a stable economic life. And when those needs clash with, the market's drive for efficiency and profits, that's where things get really interesting.
It's like he's almost sounding an alarm, warning us about what can happen when the market kind of steamrolls over those basic human needs. And that tension seems to play out in how globalization unfolds in the late 19th century.
It's a crucial period, for sure. Think about it. You have massive technological leaps, a population boom, huge waves of migration. And with all that comes this surge in trade and investment, transportation costs plummeter. The world is getting smaller, more connected.
Right. And DeLong has this great example about the price of flour. Like in 1850, flour cost 1.5 cents a pound in Chicago, but double that in London. By 1890, thanks to cheaper shipping, Londoners were paying just 2 cents a pound. That's a massive change.
It really shows how the world was becoming one big marketplace.
It does.
Yeah.
But here's where things get tricky. As goods and people move more freely, you see this global division of labor emerging. Some regions, what we call the Global South today, end up stuck producing raw materials for low wages, and it makes it harder for them to develop their own industries.
Exactly. It's that double-edged sword of globalization. But DeLong makes you wonder, was this division inevitable, or was it a result of choices made by those in power?
Yeah, he uses rubber as a case study.
Mhm.
In the late 19th century, the British Empire set up these rubber plantations in Malaya. But it wasn't because Malaya was naturally the best place to grow rubber.
Right. It was about exploiting the cheap labor there. So these so-called comparative advantages weren't just natural, they were created through policy and economic strategy.
Okay, so they were kind of engineered
Yeah.
in a way. And what about the long-term effects of that? Did creating these advantages have ripple effects throughout the global economy?
Absolutely. The influx of cheap Asian labor kept wages down, not just in Asia itself, but also in other rubber-producing regions like Brazil. It was this race to the bottom in terms of wages. Living standards in much of the global south stayed low.
Even if they were a little better than places like China or India, where people had even fewer options, I guess. So globalization is reshaping the world, but in ways that benefit some more than others. But what about technology during this time? DeLong talks about a quintuple breakthrough around 1870 that really changes things.
Yeah, he's talking about cheaper transportation, faster communication, expanding global trade. But the two things that really shake things up are the Industrial Research Lab and the modern corporation. These two, they kind of feed off each other.
Like a perfect storm of innovation, right?
Yeah.
You've got this space dedicated to invention, the research lab, and then these huge organizations, the corporations ready to take those inventions and run with them.
Exactly. So now inventors aren't just lone geniuses tinkering away. They're part of a system, and they can focus on pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And then you've got these corporations, these efficiency machines, ready to scale up production and get those inventions out to the masses.
It makes me think of the Bessemer-Mushet process for making steel. DeLong uses that as a prime example of how technology can reshape a whole industry.
Right. Before that breakthrough, steel was super expensive, used for stuff like swords and high-end tools that needed that sharp, durable edge. The Bessemer process made steel like 7 times cheaper. So suddenly you have steel being used for bridges, skyscrapers, you name it, it's everywhere.
So it wasn't just the invention itself. It's also about having the infrastructure to take advantage of it. And corporations played a huge role in that. And DeLong argues that even these seemingly inevitable advancements weren't a sure thing, right? Like the Industrial Research Lab, it wasn't some eureka moment. It took years of experimentation, collaboration, and sometimes even competition.
He really emphasizes that history is messier and less predictable than we think. DeLong uses this kind of chilling story, Lillian Cross and the guy who tried to assassinate FDR, Giuseppe Zangara. In 1933, Zangara tries to shoot Roosevelt, but Cross accidentally bumps him, deflecting the bullet.
Wow, that's a crazy story. So Roosevelt lives, but Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who was standing nearby, gets killed. It makes you wonder how differently things might have gone if that bullet had hit its target.
Yeah, it really does.
It shows how random events can intersect with those bigger historical forces we've been talking about. But even with all this amazing technological progress, the benefits weren't shared equally. DeLong highlights how industrial workers were struggling in the early 20th century, especially in the U.S.
Even as factories became more efficient and corporations more powerful, working conditions were often still really brutal. Think about Henry Ford and the assembly line. It revolutionized car production, yeah, but the work itself was incredibly repetitive and grueling.
DeLong points out that in 1913, Ford had an average workforce of 13,600, but over 50,400 people quit or were fired that year. That's almost 4 times the average workforce.
It's mind-boggling.
It gives you an idea of how bad those working conditions must have been. It was clear that the benefits of progress weren't reaching everyone.
Right. And as the world became more interconnected, people became more aware of these inequalities, which is what fueled social movements. You see labor unions, socialist parties, all these calls for greater economic justice. It was a time of intense debate between those who believed in letting the market run free and those who wanted the government to step in and make things more fair.
It feels like we're looking at a world on the verge of some major changes. Globalization is transforming economies, technology is advancing at an incredible pace, and there are these growing demands for social and economic justice. And then World War I just explodes onto the scene, throwing everything into chaos.
And the war, as you can imagine, totally disrupts the global order. Trade networks are shattered, economies are devastated, and that pre-war optimism is replaced by uncertainty and disillusionment.
It seems like a turning point, the end of one era and the beginning of something new, but uncertain. And it's in this context, right in the middle of all this upheaval, that John Maynard Keynes enters the picture.
Keynes, he's this brilliant and often controversial economist, and he really becomes a key figure in this period. He challenges the traditional economic thinking of the time, especially this idea that markets will self-correct and that government intervention in the economy is always a bad thing. These were very deeply held beliefs back then, but the war and its aftermath forced people to rethink them.
Yeah, and Keynes' ideas seem especially relevant as the world plunges into the Great Depression. Millions are unemployed, economies are shrinking, and those old solutions of austerity and balanced budgets just aren't working. It's a crisis that demands new thinking.
And that's exactly what Keynes provides. He argues that governments have a crucial role to play in stimulating demand and getting those economies moving again. He advocates for government spending, even if it means running budget deficits, to get people back to work.
It was a radical idea at the time, going against the grain of conventional wisdom. I imagine there was a lot of pushback against his theories, especially from those who benefited from the way things were.
Oh, absolutely. But as the Great Depression dragged on and those traditional solutions failed, Keynes's ideas started to gain some traction. They would end up having a huge impact on economic policy in the decades that followed.
Right, and we'll dive into that impact in the next part of our deep dive. For now, we've set the stage. We've got globalization, technological innovation, the rise of social movements, the devastation of World War I, and the emergence of John Maynard Keynes. It's a complicated and fascinating period of history that really sets the stage for the economic and political landscape of the 20th century.
So as we move deeper into the 20th century, these big ideological clashes, they're playing out on a global scale. DeLong talks about this period, 1870 to 1914, as this time of incredible optimism. Global trade is booming, technology is advancing like never before, and there's this genuine belief that we're, on the verge of a golden age.
It's interesting how DeLong uses the word utopia to describe what people were striving for back then. It really captures that sense of, anything is possible.
Right. But then, as we talked about, World War I happens, and that just shatters all that optimism. It exposes these deep cracks in society.
The war makes everyone question everything. Progress, rationality, the idea of a shared future, all of it is suddenly up for debate. And after the war, you see all these different visions for how to rebuild the world starting to emerge.
Exactly. You've got the rise of communism in Russia, fueled by this promise of a workers' paradise, a total reordering of society. But, as DeLong makes clear, the reality under Stalin was anything but utopian.
Yeah, he doesn't sugarcoat it. The brutality of Stalin's regime, the forced collectivization of agriculture, the purges, the gulags, it's a scary reminder of how those utopian ideals can be twisted into, tools of oppression.
And at the same time, you have fascism rising in Italy and Germany. It rejected both the liberal values of the West and the communist vision of the Soviet Union.
It's this dangerous ideology, driven by nationalism, militarism, and a cult of personality around figures like Mussolini and Hitler. And again, it's that dark side of utopian thinking, this belief that the ends justify the means, no matter how brutal.
And meanwhile, the democracies of the West are struggling to recover from the war, trying to deal with the economic devastation of the Great Depression. This is where Keynesian ideas, which had been around for a while, start to gain real traction. Governments are forced to rethink their role in the economy, and the idea of intervening to manage demand, to stabilize markets, it becomes more mainstream.
So Keynes' theories, which once seemed radical, are now seen as a possible solution to this global economic crisis. But World War II is already on the horizon. DeLong argues that the seeds of that conflict were sown right after the First World War.
He points to several things, like the harsh peace terms imposed on Germany, the rise of nationalism across Europe, the failure of democracies to deal with the economic and social turmoil of the Great Depression. It's complex, but DeLong also highlights specific decisions that, looking back, seem incredibly short-sighted.
Like Britain's decision to go to war with the Boers in South Africa. DeLong says that any reasonable cost-benefit analysis would have shown it to be a terrible idea, but they did it anyway.
Yeah, it's another one of those what-if moments in history. What if Britain had made different choices? What if they'd focused on fixing the inequalities and injustices in their own society instead of these costly foreign wars?
It's easy to get caught up in those what-ifs, but as you said, history doesn't give us do-overs. So the world is headed toward another devastating war. But DeLong makes this interesting point about World War II. He says that despite all the horrors, the war actually sped up some positive trends, like the rise of the United States as a global power.
Right, the U.S. came out of the war with a massively expanded industrial capacity, the strongest military in the world. That new power, combined with the desire to prevent another global war, it really shaped the post-war world.
And you see the creation of all these new institutions. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, they were all meant to foster international cooperation and avoid the kind of instability that led to war.
Exactly. And the U.S., with all its resources and global influence, takes the lead in promoting free trade and globalization as the path to peace and prosperity. But it's also a time of intense ideological competition. The Cold War divides the world into these two camps, the capitalist West, led by the U.S., and the communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union, and they're locked in this global struggle for dominance.
It's a struggle that's happening on so many levels. Military buildups, proxy wars, economic competition, even a battle for the hearts and minds of people around the world. But in the middle of all this tension, you see this remarkable period of economic growth and social progress in the West, what some call the 30 glorious years. How does DeLong explain that?
He largely attributes it to the success of social democracy, the combination of Keynesian economics, strong unions, and those robust welfare states. It created this upward spiral of economic growth, rising living standards, and social stability.
It seems like a viable alternative to both the laissez-faire capitalism that contributed to the Great Depression and the authoritarian communism of the Soviet Union. But as we know, it doesn't last forever. What leads to the decline of social democracy and the rise of neoliberalism later in the 20th century?
Well, by the 1970s, that post-war economic boom was starting to slow down. Inflation was rising, unemployment was creeping up, and those old Keynesian solutions were losing their effectiveness. It was a time of economic uncertainty and what some called stagflation, stagnant growth and rising prices, a really bad combination.
Sounds like a textbook case of a paradigm shift, right? The old model wasn't working anymore and people were desperate for new solutions.
Exactly. And that's when neoliberalism comes onto the scene. It offered a completely different approach, one that emphasized free markets, deregulation, getting the government out of the economy. It was, in many ways, a return to those classical liberal ideas that had been challenged by social democracy.
And this shift was really championed by leaders like Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. They argued that neoliberalism was the key to unlocking economic growth, taming inflation, and creating a more dynamic and prosperous society.
And they were very successful in implementing a lot of their policies, from tax cuts and deregulation to privatizing state-owned industries. The impact was huge. It reshaped not just individual economies, but the entire global economic order.
But DeLong doesn't just praise neoliberalism, right? He also looks at the negative consequences.
He does. While neoliberalism did help lower inflation and make some economies more dynamic, it also contributed to rising income inequality, a decline in the power of unions, and a weaker safety net for a lot of people.
Sounds like a classic case of unintended consequences. The policies designed to boost economic growth ended up creating forces that eroded social cohesion and left a lot of people behind.
And DeLong argues that the financial crisis of 2008 was, in a lot of ways, a result of the excesses and imbalances created by decades of neoliberal policies. Deregulating financial markets, coupled with this belief that markets could regulate themselves, led to a system that was full of risk and very vulnerable.
And that crisis really calls the whole neoliberal project into question. Governments are forced to intervene on a massive scale to prevent total economic collapse. And we're left with this renewed debate about the role of government, the balance between markets and social welfare, the very nature of capitalism.
It's a debate that's still going on today. We're still dealing with the fallout of the 2008 crisis, and we're still trying to find a sustainable and equitable way forward.
So we've covered a lot. From that pre-war optimism to two world wars, the rise and fall of social democracy, the complicated legacy of neoliberalism, it's a really complex and often contradictory story. But what I find most striking is how DeLong combines these big historical forces with the personal stories of the people who lived through it all.
Absolutely. And in the next part of our depth dive, we'll look at some of those individual stories, see how these big economic and political shifts played out in the lives of everyday people. It reminds us that history isn't just about abstract ideas. It's about real people making choices, trying to survive, and sometimes even thriving in the middle of all the chaos.
I think that's something our listeners can really connect with. After all, we're all living through our own historical moment, making choices that will shape the future, for good or bad. So we've talked about big ideas, economic systems, the whole shebang. But what really brings this history to life are the individual stories that DeLong weaves into it all. Makes you remember, we're not just talking about abstract forces, right? We're talking about real people making decisions, often in some pretty tough situations.
Yeah, for sure. Those personal stories, they're so important. They ground those big narratives, like Henry Ford in the assembly line. He was a true visionary, revolutionized car production, made cars affordable for everybody.
It's an amazing achievement.
Mm-hmm.
But DeLong doesn't shy away from the downsides either. Like Ford's focus on efficiency, it created a system that was, well, kind of dehumanizing in a lot of ways. We talked about that crazy turnover rate at his factories.
Right. Really makes you think about the cost of progress,
It does. It makes you ask, what is progress, really? Is it just about technology and economic growth? Or is there something more to it, like human well-being and all that?
It's a question that runs through DeLong's whole book, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's a question that's more relevant than ever, I think. As we move into the 21st century with all its amazing technology and those challenges that just never seem to go away.
Absolutely. And it's not just about technology's impact on workers either. Think about Nikola Tesla, this brilliant inventor, convinced that alternating current was the future of electricity. But he had to fight tooth and nail against Thomas Edison, who was all about direct current.
Oh, yeah. It was a clash of titans, for sure.
Yes.
A battle of ideas, but also personalities and business interests.
And in the end, Tesla's vision won out. AC became the standard, shaped the world we live in today. It reminds you that progress often means fighting an uphill battle, going against the grain.
Yeah, like swimming upstream. Tesla's a perfect example of how one person, if they're persistent enough, can change the course of history. But DeLong also reminds us that individuals, they don't exist in a bubble. They're shaped by the world around them.
Like John Maynard Keynes, brilliant economist, right? Challenged the way everyone thought about economics back then. Argued that the government should play a bigger role in managing the economy. His ideas were controversial, but as we talked about, they really changed economic policy, especially after World War II.
He really understood that markets, even though they can be powerful drivers of innovation and growth, they can also be unstable, lead to crises. And he believed the government had a duty to step in to kind of smooth things out, make the system more stable and fair.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But DeLong doesn't just focus on the winners, the big thinkers and innovators.
Mm-hmm.
He also makes us face those darker parts of 20th century history. The stories of the people who suffered under oppressive regimes, like the millions who died in Stalin's gulags or were victims of the Nazis.
Yeah, it's tough to hear those stories, but important. They remind us of how dangerous extremism can be, how fragile freedom is. We can't forget about protecting individual rights and democratic institutions.
It's a message that hits home, especially these days. We're seeing authoritarianism on the rise, democratic norms eroding. It's happening all over the world.
It definitely makes you think. The lessons of the 20th century, they're not just history. They're challenges we're still dealing with today.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. The optimism of the early 1900s, two world wars, the rise and fall of social democracy, the impact of neoliberalism. It's a complicated story. But what DeLong really drives home, I think, is how unpredictable history is.
Yeah. He shows us that the future isn't set in stone, that it's shaped by the choices we make, both as individuals and as a society.
He's asking us to learn from the past, to see the potential pitfalls and possibilities of our own time, to be active in shaping a future that's both prosperous and just.
Because we're living through our own historical moment, right? And the decisions we're making right now, they'll have consequences for generations to come.
So, listener, as you think about everything we've discussed, all those economic theories and the people who lived through those times, ask yourself this. What will you take away from the 20th century? What choices will you make to help build a 21st century that's both prosperous and fair? The deep dive, it never really ends, does it? It's up to all of us to keep exploring, to wrestle with those tough questions, and to help create a better future. Thanks for joining us.